This episode's brought to you by Heidi. Imagine kicking back while a HIPAA-compliant AI scribe writes your soap notes for free. Yes, you heard us right, Heidi is free. I'm Dr. Tom, Heidi's CEO and founder, and we started Heidi to stop clinicians wasting their life on clinical documentation. Heidi transforms your consult babble into crisp, clear soap notes, personalizing itself with every edit. One day, Heidi will be your AI resident, looking through research, explaining plans, and doing anything you don't want to. If you currently pay for an AI scribe in your practice, you should swap to Heidi. We'll even credit you for anything you've already paid. Dive into the description for the link and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town. Sign up and watch Heidi work its magic, all for free, because you've got better things to do.
When we give patients a new diagnosis or recommend a workup or treatment plan, they aren't always on board, and sometimes they need to be persuaded. So today, I interviewed the author of The Rules of Persuasion to help us do that better. Check it out. Hey, this is Brad Block, host of The Physician's Guide to Doctoring. This is a personal and professional development podcast for physicians where we have experts on the show that try to teach us everything we should have been learning while we were memorizing Krebs cycle. Welcome back to the podcast. On today's episode, we have Carlos Alvarenga. He's an independent researcher and writer, and his new book, The Rules of Persuasion, How the World's Greatest Communicators Convince, Inspire, Lead, and Sometimes Deceive, which was published in August of 2023. Prior to writing full-time, he worked first as a journalist and then as a management consultant. He's currently a PhD student in English at the University of Maryland, where his research focuses on the rhetoric of totalitarian regimes, timely considering the current political landscape in the U.S. He holds a BA in Humanities and Classical Greek from Hampden-Sydney College and completed his post-bacc program in classics at my alma mater, University of Pennsylvania. He resides in Bethesda, Maryland, with most important part of his bio here, with his wife, a physician researcher at the NIH, and he's the father of two sons. I have to tell you, my favorite part of the book, or parts of the book rather, is the juxtaposition of persuasion used in different arenas. For instance, he cites the classics, the Bible, Hemingway, and then, I think maybe even all in the same chapter, Goodfellas, Star Wars, and Ratatouille. It's not only a really interesting read, but it's things like that keep you engaged and keep it relevant the whole time. So, Carlos Alvarenga, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Brad. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with your audience.
You wrote that the function of all communication is to persuade, not just certain communication, but all communication. And sometimes I grapple with the role that physicians have with their patients. Like, are we supposed to be presenting information in an unbiased way and just let them decide? Or to try and persuade them to take a certain action that we think is most consistent with their healthcare goals? But if you're saying all communication is persuasion, it's not really a decision, right? Like, we're not thinking about whether or not we should do this or not, because ultimately, whether we like it or not, communication is persuasion.
And I say almost all, because there are a few examples here and there. But generally speaking, when we interact with someone, we're almost always trying to get them to either believe something or agree to something. And to say that I'm completely unbiased, it would require a kind of indifference to the outcome, right? In the sense that I don't really care which way it goes. I think it's the nature of medicine to care. It's in the nature of medicine to want the patient to make the right choice. And that is, again, in a Aristotle term, that is the nature of physicians, to make a body better and to heal a patient. So I would imagine that even if you think you're not aware of that, there probably is some sense of there is, if not a right and a wrong, a better and a less better option.
And so at that point, then I think own it. Like, if it's going to happen passively, then just engage with that fact and recognize that it is part of what we do.
I think so. I think it is, again, in classical terms, you would say it is in the nature of being a physician to heal a patient, just the way it is a musician to play music, right? Or an athlete to compete in athletics. It is what the role is in societal terms.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So you discuss really early on in the book what the framework for persuasion is. So walk us through what the framework is.
I'll explain that in two parts. What Aristotle sets out as the foundation, and then what I contribute and why I wrote the book to Aristotle's foundation. So what he says is in a remarkable book called The Rhetoric. And the Rhetoric book is a book which is interesting because it wasn't meant to be read by us. We don't really know exactly what it's for, but most likely it was either private teaching notes, because he created the academy, or it was a handbook for students. But he probably never imagined that we would be reading it. So it isn't written as a book that you read. And there's a strange thing about Aristotle, which scholars have noted this. The more obvious something is, the less he explains it. And persuasion falls into that category. Aristotle wouldn't waste 5 pages on why the sky is blue. It's just blue. So he says, of all the ways to persuade someone, they can be grouped into 3, what I call modes in the book. The character of the speaker, who or what is speaking to me? Person, school, institution, hospital, government, right? The arguments presented, logic, proof, statistics, authorities, right? Evidence, witnesses. And then the emotion that the audience feels as they listen to the speaker or receive the message. And this has been here for 2,400 years. You've heard it often described as ethos, pathos, logos. You read that in many articles. The reason I wrote my book is that I had a question, and that was, well, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by character? What do you mean by argument? What do you mean by emotion? And exactly what is persuasion? And so I became consumed with this question. And what I say in my book, and the metaphor I follow in the book is, if you think about the character of a communicator, we can, for the sake of this exercise, divide it into 7 elements, I call them. So the origin, history, style, language, status, right? The same thing with argument. There's logic, there are authorities, and so on and so forth. And then I say there are 7 kinds of emotion: positive, negative, exhortative, inspirational, mystical. What I say is that if we take these 21 things, we can think of them as a kind of periodic table. Okay, so this is what I call the periodic table of persuasion. All messages are built from some combination of these 21 elements. So the best way to think of it is chemistry with words, right? Great communicators make a formula, which your audience will appreciate, right? Deliver the formula. If the chemistry is good, persuasion is effective.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to use the Pareto's principle here, where you need to understand 20% of it to get 80% of it, especially when we're talking about something specific like, doctor to patient communications, because I don't think we're going to be able to master all 21, but there are probably a small number of combinations that apply to us. And we'll get to that. We'll get to that later on, I think.
Hey, by the way, what we find is that most formulations are ancient. We rarely find someone who comes with something new. For example, if your father or mother were here and could see the way you behave, act as if they were watching you. This is as old as time. This idea of your ancestors, the gods, right? Some unseen power or authority is watching your behavior. So what you find is that really these formulations, for the most part, are they're ancient, and also, yes, you're right. All 21 elements are not going to be mastered by one person, but you don't have to. And most of us have a few that we're actually sort of natively good at. And so as I explained in the book, most of the time we don't persuade, not because we can't, but because we don't understand that there are more elements on the shelf that I could pull from. And if a little bit of this added to the mix would just make it work a lot better than what I'm using today.
It's like when you're cooking, people often leave out acidity. All you need to do to add to your repertoire is a little bit of acidity, and boom, your dishes are going to be a whole lot better.
There you go.
All right. So we're going to add a little bit of acidity to our persuasion. So you talk about Aristotle's 3 principles of persuasion, and then you've subdivided all of those. Or have there been any other great updates in persuasion in the last 2,300 years?
I haven't read every book on persuasion, so my logic teacher would say you can't answer this question with anything other than a qualified statement. I say I haven't found them, if there are. I haven't come across them. And it's one other reason why I wrote this book is that I bought books about persuasion to use in my coaching practice, and they really weren't about persuasion. They were about psychology or manipulation or almost sort of automatic responses to certain things. And I kept going back to Aristotle over and over again as the definitive statement about persuasion and communication. Now, if we look at rhetoric, the evolution of what we started as persuasion today. In the academic sense, there's a lot of fantastic work. This is the things that I study at Maryland, right? And I'd say that is more of a specialist topic. For example, the rhetoric of violence or totalitarian regimes. I'd say the application of some of these ideas certainly has evolved, but I think that ultimately the foundation of what persuasion is in human interaction, it's what Aristotle found, and it's still correct.
I guess it's like arithmetic hasn't been updated in thousands of years. So persuasion, I guess, it's just how our brains work. So then,
just another point there is that people ask about how does my book relate to other books on persuasion and influence? And I say, we had medicine long before we had chemistry. These books are medicine. I think of my book as chemistry. It's a chemistry textbook for language. So it is why that book about selling is a great book about selling, or why that book about negotiation is good. We knew that this plant cures a headache before we knew why, trying to give people the why.
Interesting. Okay. So then what would be a good start for physicians, right? Rather than the 3 principles all subdivided into 7, where do we even begin?
I think you begin by understanding that there are 3 modes. When I start coaching, what I found every single time, and I've coached dozens of people, it goes something like this. We have these 3 dials, imagine in a message, right? Character from 0 to 10, like Spinal Tap, or 11 if you're a Spinal Tap fan, right? Argument, and then emotion. Almost everyone I work with, character is at 0 or 1, maybe a 2. Emotion is almost always a 0, right? Which means that like a ship with 3 masts and only 1 sail, that sail is pretty tattered, right? It's doing all the work. And my advice is, listen, you've got 2 sails that are furled up. Why not unfurl the sail? You're going to go a lot faster. You're going to put less strain on the second one, and everything's going to work a lot better. So mostly it's just, hey, what is available to you, right? What is available to you that you could put into the formulation that's right at hand? And almost always it's just a little bit of change, and suddenly things work a lot better. So it's about not a wholesale change of becoming some kind of PhD in persuasion. It's simply just start by knowing that there are these 3 dials, and let's put dial 1 and dial 2 off as 0 and see what the effect is. And it's almost always a positive effect.
Well, so let's talk about character, right? Because during a physician-patient interaction, right, there might be certain assumptions about our character, and that's why they came to see us. Now, there might not be, right? It might be the emergency department where you don't choose your physician, it's just whoever's available next. Also, there might be something that the patient assumes about your character because you're in that role. So how can we leverage character more to our advantage?
So let's talk about 3 of the 7 character elements quickly. So one is categories. So those are the things that for the most part you choose. So you went to UPenn, you're now in the category of UPenn alumni. You chose to become a doctor, you're now in the category of men who become doctors, right? And so on. Associations are connections the audience makes about us. So we're almost always not in control of those. So just understanding that a person walks into a room who seems hurried or nervous or preoccupied, the audience brain begins to move quickly. This person doesn't care about me. I'm just one in a production line of patients. And these conclusions are being spun while you're still looking at the chart, before you even looked at the patient. The patient has made 75 associations, maybe because of a bad experience 5 years ago. And before you've said a word, you're now in a negative position. They are predisposed not to believe you. And you think the conversation hasn't started yet. It started the moment they heard you walking down the hallway or heard the door begin to move.
Or spent 45 minutes in your waiting room.
45 minutes thinking about who you are. You gave them plenty of time. By the way, it's nothing to. It's your choice. The more time you give them, from the moment they get into that gown and you walk in the door, the more time they have to look around the office, to categorize you, to make associations. So this idea that the conversation begins when you start to speak, in my sense, I think it's wrong. It started the moment they sat down and began to think about who you are and who they're about to hear from. The other thing is status. So I mentioned that status is the power of this communicator relative to the audience, right? And status is interesting because status works bidirectionally. What does that mean? It works by affirmation. So I'm the boss, do what I tell you, or I'm the boss and I've done these wonderful things. but it also works by negation. So Undercover Boss, the TV show, a boss stops being the boss, right? So it's by negating status that you gain persuasive effect. Same thing the Pope does when he washes the pilgrim's feet. So you have this choice of whether am I going to affirm my status, which is high relative to a patient, or am I going to negate it in some way? I think that's a subtle question to ask yourself in this moment, in this room with this patient, which is better, affirming status or reducing it in some way? And I would imagine for some people it's one, for some it's another, but that tends to be not the case. It tends to be that most doctors will affirm status as a default state, which may not be the right answer from a persuasion standpoint.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can't do that when you first walk in a room. You need to fill out the interaction a bit first.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's the other thing too, right? You may have 60 seconds. So what happens in those 60 seconds before the consult begins or the therapeutic or the clinical moment begins can determine the entire outcome, right? In that short span of time.
And if you're ever wondering, if your visit has gotten off to the wrong foot or you want to prevent it from getting off to the wrong foot, listen to a lot of my other episodes because we talk about this. We talk about this stuff a lot, making sure that you are engaging with the patient and respecting their time and demonstrating that you care about them and that they're the only one in the room. This is what we talk about a lot on this show. I was really hoping that you could help us be more formulaic about it, and you're really not giving me those answers.
Again, we go back to chemistry. Chemistry creates all kinds of formulas. So which formula are you looking for becomes the question, right? And as we know, chemistry creates medicine and it also creates poison. And so it's amoral. The issue is the formula for... Which
may also just be a different dose of the same thing.
Exactly, right? And great communicators are very skilled at saying it's 5% solution today, 20% tomorrow, 30% the next day because of the audience that I'm for. The issue is that once you start to think about this, and doctors are very smart people, so usually once you show them this, then they suddenly go, okay, I see it now, and I'm going to begin to regulate the message. With a little bit of practice, it becomes second nature.
So then are there any traps to avoid? I mean, you just mentioned one, which was just the overuse of leveraging authority and position, right? But are there any other traps that we should avoid when we're attempting to persuade?
I think that there are two. One is, Aristotle says that of the three modes, the most important is character. Who is talking to us? And for character to be effective, it must satisfy three conditions. One, the person knows what he or she is speaking about. So they're informed, they're experts, they know what their subject matter. Two, they speak with good intention. And three, they mean us well. Sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people don't tick that last box, right? They mean us at a very human level. They're smart. They know what they do. They went to the best schools, right? They're trying to do a good job, but do they mean me well? Me personally, the person in front of them. Are they here for my best interest? And I think people assume that that's true, but it isn't. And for character to work, all three lights must be green, according to Aristotle. The other one is that and I think this might be especially true of physicians, they devalue emotion. They don't understand or appreciate the power that the emotion has as a persuasive effect. And in fact, getting ready for today's show, I was doing some research, came across a paper that was written by a team from Baylor and Penn Medicine. And they had 5 recommendations for what they call beneficent persuasion. Of the 5, 3 are emotion and 2 are argument. Basically it's saying, think about the emotional impact. And what I found is that people think that when you say emotion, you mean tears flowing, and it's not. Sometimes it's a very small thing, right? A very small emotion is concentrated, I would say, just to extend the metaphor. A little drop can go a long way. So I'd say, think about, right, what does this patient believe every word that comes out of your mouth is for their personal goodness, their gain, their well-being? And then if they get emotional, or if you have some emotional component to this message, don't be afraid to share it. It's a very powerful thing with human beings. And I find that a lot of very technical people discount that and dismiss it. And I think that's a mistake.
To get the most out of your career as a physician, you need an employment contract that supports you. Unfortunately, most contracts do not initially include everything you need to be successful. Employers draft contracts with their best interests in mind, but the terms that benefit your employer are rarely as valuable to you. Before signing an employment contract, you should always make sure your salary, bonuses, paid time off, and other terms are fair. Resolve is the one and only place you can get live salary data, so you know exactly what's happening in your specialty at all times. The best part of the data is that it's verified from real physician contracts. With access to data on what physicians like you are earning, you know when you're being underpaid and can confidently ask for what you deserve. In addition to providing data, they're the #1 firm specializing in physician employment contracts. They work with every specialty nationwide. At Resolve, you get connected with an experienced attorney who will work with you one-on-one to ensure you sign with confidence. Your attorney will take your priorities into account, address concerns, make suggestions, and help you strategize for any negotiation. They can even negotiate with an employer on your behalf. So whether you're a seasoned attending or just finished training, Resolve is here to support you in every step of the way. Visit resolve.com to learn more and discover how to sign your ideal employment contract. Resolve, your trusted partner for physician contract review, negotiations, and salary data. So that makes me think of some things that I've learned from prior episodes. One, we had this great guest a while ago, Oscar Trimboli. He talks about the power of listening. And one of the things that he dropped during the episode was, don't just listen for facts, listen for emotion. And I think this ties in really well to them believing us if we care about them, as you said, as people and not just their disease state. And so if you listen for emotion and then you can acknowledge what they're going through, then they're more likely to believe whatever it is you say, because then they understand you recognize that there is a whole person here, not just a disease or problem that needs to be fixed.
There's a wonderful little book I recommend to everybody, because I have a chapter in the book about listening. And it's the chapter is based on a book by Dr. Salman Akhtar, who's a psychiatrist in Philadelphia. And it's a little handbook for how to listen to patients. And he talks about, I think there are various ways of listening to someone. But my favorite is what I think he calls empathetic listening, which is you're not trying to critique what the person is saying. You're not trying to find inconsistencies. Your only job as you listen is to have that person believe that you feel what they're feeling, or at least can understand it, right? And he says we, as clinicians, we tend to fall into the first kind, which is analytic listening, where I'm trying to find what's wrong and you made a mistake 3 arguments ago. He says, no. For this kind, this particular patient just wants their emotions to be acknowledged, right? And I recommend the book to anybody who works with individuals, because as you think about, I would ask the question, how many different ways do you listen? Can you listen? And which is the right one for this moment? And if you can't answer the question, then I think you're missing a critical skill set if you deal with people on a daily basis.
But it can be so tempting. When a patient's, well, my symptoms have been going on for 3 weeks. I went to urgent care really 2 days in, and I was started on antibiotics, and I just finished antibiotics yesterday. And you look in the chart, and they had a 10-day course of antibiotics. You're like, well, that math doesn't work out. There's no reason to call out the patient, because it's not going to read, as tempting as it might be to be like, listen, you made a mistake, because everybody likes to be right. And as their doctor, but don't do it. Suppress that.
Well, one of the underappreciated, I think, demands of medicine is patience, and that ability to say, okay, we're going to have to start this all over again. And yet that is it's like being a teacher, right? It's what's absolutely vital aspects of the job, right? You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So your wife is a physician, as we talked about before the show. She's a researcher at the NIH. She's a neuroradiologist. So, I was hoping to find out, what she's learned and applied to her patients. But what you told me is it's more what she's applied to managing her team. Now, as physicians, we're also team leaders, right? We have people that work for us and under us, trainees and assistants and advanced practice providers. So, as a team leader, what has she learned about persuasion?
When I asked her the question you emailed, she said the biggest thing was the use of one of the elements of character, which is called history. So what does someone know about our past? And we often assume that they know a lot, way more than they usually do. And she said, I would often say to the team, do A or do B. And I assume you're going to do it because I'm the leader of the team, right? I run the lab. So I'm the boss, right? And she said, what I learned after reading the book was that a little bit of history where I explained to them, I was a student. I went through my residency, my training, all those things. It goes a long way in getting someone to believe that this is the right thing to do, not just because the boss said it, but because there was a moment where she learned what she's trying to show me, and she's actually doing it again for my benefit. Shortcut the process. It took me a year to do this or learn something. You can learn it in a couple of months. Why would you waste a year like I did, right? And that's beautiful because it reverses status. It uses character. And it's a very nice, easy formulation that's very effective. And she said, for most of my career, I just told them, no, do whatever I told you to do. And that's it. And so that was a big change.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. But there's also some stuff I want the audience to learn and myself to learn about persuasion for things that really come up frequently. And clearly with the pandemic, a big one was vaccine hesitancy, right? Now in the book, you talk about Nike and how universal just do it is, right? Like it really makes you think about yourself and your own challenges to overcome. And you can relate to these other athletes that just, you need to endure and just suck it up and just do it. Can I just apply that to people who don't want to get vaccinated and just say, just do it?
I think it depends on the character.
I was joking. I didn't expect you to be like, yeah, Brad, that works.
No, but yes, you can. Because if you think about the thing that you heard a lot of time during the pandemic was ask your healthcare provider, ask your doctor. This is a recurring refrain. Why would they say that? It's because if you have that trust relationship, if you believe, again, the 3 green lights of character are on, and that person says, get vaccinated, and you know who's speaking to you, that's probably the single most important thing you can say to someone who's afraid. And acknowledge a fear, for example. Instead of saying, it's a city that you don't want to get vaccinated, I might be afraid for legitimate reasons. And so that, again, acknowledge emotion and then use not just status, right, but the character of who you are, which is more than just your status. I think that's the most, and it's been shown to be the most powerful formulation for getting a parent to vaccine a child or for someone to vaccine themselves. It is the character of the physician as it's understood by the patient.
I mean, how could you push that a little further? Meaning, like, I would think you would need to say something like, well, listen, I was nervous about it. So then now they can relate to you. I was nervous about it, but I decided that it was the right thing for me to get as well. I had similar reservations to you, or I totally understand where you're coming from. You're nervous. You're not sure what the right thing to do is for your kid, but I got my children vaccinated.
Think about how powerful that statement is, right? Which is to say that you don't know this about my history, but I began this with many of the similar fears. I was worried about my children. That's an emotional appeal. And ultimately, we made the choice. We think it's the best thing to do. That's a much different conversation from here's a chart, right, with how the distribution is of people who are vaccinated and not vaccinated. And people cannot follow argument anyway, as I say, at least most people can't. And the first conversation about who you are is way more powerful. And I think it's an interesting question for all professionals. You say, how much does that person know about me? Not what I think they know about me, but what do they really know about who I am? And if they don't know very much, then again, that tremendous storehouse of persuasive power is just going to waste.
Is there anything else that we can leverage in those conversations rather than just what we just said?
Yeah, I think when you use argument, and I make this case that and I think this is especially true of people who are very technical, engineers, right, business people, scientists, physicians, the more logic and facts and argument persuade you, the farther away you are from persuading the average person, because they are not persuaded by those things. They can't follow them. To follow a high-level argument, and I try to follow some of my wife's papers and presentations. After 2 or 3 minutes, I'm lost because I don't have the training that you have to follow a hardcore medical presentation at a conference for 15 minutes, right? And they're all short. So if you understand that this person will not be able to follow that very long, then intersperse that. So what does that mean? It means that break up the logic and argument and facts with other things, with narrative, with a personal reflection, with a question about their state. Are you following what I'm saying? Are you still feel comfortable? So you're still delivering the same amount of clinical or scientific information, but you're doing it in doses that a person can absorb. Instead of saying, okay, here's a 3-minute speech about what this is the right way to do, and the person was lost after 45 seconds, which is what typically happens. So sometimes just breaking that up making sure that you've got, we talk about, acknowledging consent. What about acknowledging understanding? And how long is that window? Is it 15 seconds? Is it 30 seconds? It's almost always much shorter than you think. In most technical settings, it's much shorter than people think. They overestimate the processing ability of a non-technical person, right? No matter, and it has nothing to do with IQ, right? They could be very, very smart. The human brain is, I always say, it's a big warehouse with a very small door. You hold a lot, but you're not getting anything in or out in a hurry. So just thinking that through can radically change. I've seen it happen with people, how they approach a conversation. And suddenly you see, wow, for the first time, they've understood what I said and they're going to do what I told them. And all they did was change the sequencing a little bit.
I think for me, often it's, who am I speaking for right now? Like, I can look at the patient and see that they've zoned out. And I know I really want to get all this stuff off of my chest, and I feel like it needs to be said. But at this point, I'm talking for me, not for them. And this is not the me show. This is the them show. So they're the star, not me. So, all right, that's when it's time to break it up with some of those, appeal to emotion or narrative or something that's going to be a little more engaging than just fact.
And back to that, those 3 green lights, right? The first one, it should be automatic, I'm sure, for the audience, which is, do they know what they're talking about? But then, do they speak with good intentions? And do they care about me? And that last one, it can be hard to turn that light green, right? We're busy and we got other things in our mind. Even with our kids, sometimes we say something, but they want to know, are you really saying this for you? Back to your point. Or is this for me?
Good point. I think that's a great one to always go back to, right? Like, have I proven to the patient that I care about them as a whole person? And if not, then I need to go back to that.
There's still something to work on, even if it's just that one little part of the model, right?
So we're running out of time, but there's one more thing that I really, really want to cover because I run into it a lot in my practice. And it's when you're giving them a diagnosis that contradicts what they thought they had. And so sometimes this doesn't happen so much with me, but I'll give you an example. Someone is convinced that they have chronic Lyme disease. It becomes part of their identity. I am chronic Lyme. Now, chronic Lyme is not real. It's something that, unfortunately, a lot of physicians, give people high doses of antibiotics, and it's just appealing to what the patients think they have. Oh, I've found someone who's finally listening to me. There is something called post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, which is very real. They don't have Lyme anymore, so you're not treating that. But they come in thinking that they have this thing. For me, they come in thinking that they have postnasal drip that's making them cough, when really it's asthma that's making them cough. Or they come in with migraines that are giving them sinus pressure, and they've been told over and over that they have sinus infection. So they come in thinking that their diagnosis is one thing, and I have to convince them that they're wrong, and I'm right.
But here's the thing. Are they wrong?
Yes, they are, because the diagnosis that they've been given by someone else that they've then believed, I'm right. No, Carlos, I'm right. I am right.
Let's say you spent your whole life at my school, and at my school, I taught you that circles have 4 equilateral sides. Okay. This is the school you went to your whole life. Then you move away from it. You go to a good school. They teach you, no, a circle is a circle, right? And so were you wrong in believing that circle had 4 equilateral sides? No, you weren't. You weren't wrong because your whole life you have been taught by a bad teacher, right? So the patient isn't wrong. What they believe is wrong. What they were told is wrong. The last person they saw was wrong, who may have made the best choice at that time with, right? But when you start with the assumption that you, the person in front of me, who's in a weakened position relative to status again, you're wrong, I'm right, then we're off to a bad start. The information is wrong. The diagnosis was wrong. The person you spoke to was wrong. And just by separating them from the information, you allow them the chance to consider the possibility that this is not an attack against them, or it's not a correction of them as human beings, but it's a correction of information. It's actually a great thing. We know more now about your condition. What about that? Where we say, you know what, we have a new test. And I want to run this new test. And this gives us a much better sense of what's really going on with you. And so you run the new test, you come back, right? And suddenly you go, wow, this is great. We have a much better picture, right, of what you have. to me, to say that this visit made you smarter about me, made me more right, is a lot more persuasive than, oh, I'm an idiot and I don't know what I'm doing, or I believe stupid things, where my emotional reaction to that is not going to be very positive. So my advice would be, patient's not wrong. What they believe is wrong. What they were told is wrong. Patient is right.
But you don't want to undermine, also, I don't want to undermine other healthcare providers that they've seen, right? That, as you said, were doing the best they could with the information they had. And, also leave room for the fact that I also might be wrong. I can't walk into it that way, right? Because I have to assume that I could be wrong, but we're going to work under the assumption that I'm correct until we're proven otherwise, just because that's how we, arrive at diagnoses.
Kessler a guy named Thomas Kessler wrote a book about cosmology, right? And they interviewed him after the book came out, and he said, in science, or at least in cosmology, we're never more right, we're just less wrong over time. And I thought that's such a nice attitude to have, right? We're not more right about your condition, we're just less wrong than we were. And so if you can phrase it in that way, it's a kind of humble stance, right? You might get a very different reaction than the one I've had, being the person who was told, no, everybody you've seen is a quack. I'm the genius that figured out what's wrong with your ear. As of this moment, lucky you that you came into my room, into my orbit.
I mean, ultimately, it's not that. It's just that I see the same few things over and over. So I don't have to be good at tons of things. I just have to be good at those few that I see over and over. But I see what you're saying. I think the way I need to spin it is with more humility, which is like, listen, the reason you're here is because you haven't been getting better. So let's try something different and see if it works. So leave the fallibility in there and the humility in there to be able to bring them more on the same level, rather than leveraging the authority like we were talking about at the beginning.
In that case, right, the reversal has such a powerful effect. It's so unexpected. They expect what you just said. Instead, they get someone who says, you know what, I think we have a better picture of what's going on now. I'm really happy about that. And it's great news for you. The same information is being conveyed, the same outcome is being sought, but the persuasive formulation uses different elements. And I think that's a much more powerful persuasion form.
And because that's what we call a callback, right? We're referencing what we talked about at the beginning, which is something they use in stand-up comedy routines, and a great way to end the podcast interview. So Carlos Alvarenga, thank you so much for your time. Everyone go out and check out the book, The Rules of Persuasion, How the World's Greatest Communicators Convince, Inspire, Lead, and Sometimes Deceive.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks again from Heidi. Elevate your practice with a free AI scribe, zero cost, HIPAA compliant, and time saving. Ready to swap? We've got you covered for past AI scribe expenses. Head to HeidiHealth.com, get started, and make your practice the envy of every stethoscope in town.
Thanks for listening. I have a favor to ask. You listened to the episode until the end, which means you either fell asleep or you really liked the episode. So please share it, or like it, or comment on a social media post, or write us a 5-star review. Something. It would really help me out. And maybe what you learned from this episode can help someone else too. The views expressed in this episode are those of the interviewer and interviewee, and don't represent the views of their employer or even their significant other. Even though the magic of podcasting make it sound like I'm talking directly to you, this is not a doctor-patient relationship, and this is not medical advice, or financial advice, or really any advice. Thank us again for listening to The Physician's Guide to Doctoring.